Hello and welcome to Voices of Pueblo, brought to you by the Pueblo Star-Journal. I'm Ben Kaysen here with my good friend Taylor Blanchard. Taylor, how are we doing?
Oh, pretty well today. How about yourself?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Boy, we've got a mystery to unsolve today.
Unsolve,
whatever you'd call it.
Yeah.
Today we are focusing on Bridey Murphy. Bum, bum, bum.
Quite a hypnotizzy, if you will.
Quite a hypnotizzy. I like that. We've got a bit of a Pueblo story. Taylor's been working on it for us for the Star-Journal. We just put out the big first article on the story. We're probably going to have a couple more coming. If you want to check out the article, go check out pueblostarjournal.org. You can get connected with either a pickup location, or you can read the article there as well by hitting paper in that top bar. But what we want to do here on this podcast is we want to talk a little bit about the story behind it, tell the story, and then a little more than that, dive into why Taylor is so obsessed with it. Because Taylor, it's almost a story inside of itself, how you've gotten hooked onto the story. But
it is.
Yeah.
It's really funny. And it's really kind of rooted in this idea of print media. You know, I found that it's very intertwined. Of course, I'll tell you in detail the story of Bridey Murphy. But what I found most fascinating about it is I started on this journey 4 years ago. I published an article with another paper, and then I put it down. I mean, there are a lot of Pueblo stories. There's really cool history to go in and dig into, and that's a fascination of mine, being a native. But this one specifically, there's just so much that has remained unexplored on so many different levels. So hopefully we can touch on some of that.
I'm with you, man. That's great.
Right.
Well, let's start with a simple question. Tell me a story. What are we talking about? Bridey Murphy, hypnotism.
Bridey Murphy.
Let me know.
So this story starts out, it takes place, just to give you some context, around the time that Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone really came into the fold. So imagine, you know, you're in America in the 50s, and there were some different ways of thinking about media censorship, the Truman Doctrine, the Fair Use Doctrine, those sorts of things. And so there were taboo subjects. There was stuff that just simply wasn't looked at, wasn't covered in the 3 channels on television and in print media at large. This story blows it wide open. And like most good inventions, it happens sort of simultaneously to other things, which is why I tie it into the Twilight Zone. But Bridey Murphy is the name of a woman who came about as a result of a series of hypnotic experiments. Bridey Murphy was not the name of the woman who was hypnotized, but rather the woman she claimed to be in a past life. So there are 6 hours of recorded testimony, as it's called, between a Pueblo businessman named Maury Bernstein, who just so happened to be an amateur hypnotist, and Virginia Teague, Tige, who is known as Ruth Simmons in the book to keep her identity preserved. Now, later on, we find out that just got blown out of the water too, and now everybody knows. And 67 years removed, we can sort of step off of that.
Yeah,
but it all starts with Maury. He is this local Pueblo businessman. He has a place called Bernstein Brothers on Santa Fe Avenue in the 100 block. And this business has been around since 1890. He's a 3rd generation. They do industrial agriculture wholesales. They've got retail outlets, national chains, thousands of products. And that is his primary focus and his primary business. But in the beginning, he gets this call. The first chapter of the book is talking about receiving this unexpected call sort of early into the evening. And it really does start with, it was a dark and stormy night, or, you know, the equivalent of it. It was talking about a storm. So anyway, this guy gets stuck from going from Denver to Pueblo in his private airplane because of the storm. And he just so happens to remember that his cousin, George Taylor, is a very good client of Maury Bernstein, and was told that, hey, if you ever get stranded in Pueblo, call this guy up. Kind of like, I owe you a favor, right? Or just, you know, the way the business goes. So he calls him. He calls Maury. Maury picks up. He's about to go on about his evening with his wife, Hazel. And he says, hey, I'm stranded. I was told to call you. You know, could you pick me up? And he goes, yeah. I'll pick you up. He does. And brings him back over to the house, lets him put the bags down and get settled. And then, as a good host would, he invites him out to a cocktail party that he and his wife were going to that night. Well, lo and behold, Maury, at this point, who just the businessman Maury, is kind of shocked and taken aback by the fact that everybody starts talking about hobbies, and his guest is an amateur hypnotist. And, he sort of scoffs at that, but the hypnotist proceeds and asks if there were any willing volunteers. So a tall blonde woman says, yes, I'd be willing to. She sits down, and the hypnotist pulls a ring off of his finger, and he holds it in front of her face, and he says, pay attention to the ring. Minutes go by. Little side conversations are starting off in the room, and everybody seems more interested in the food that's in the kitchen. But eventually, this woman is in a sort of sleeping state. She's no longer exactly responsive. And the hypnotist comes up and says, okay, well, now I can prove it. Now she's ready. And the way that he proved that she was, in fact, under a hypnotic trance was, she said, when you wake up, you'll take 2 bites of your food, and then, inexplicably, you'll take your left shoe and sock off, and you'll hold it in your hand, and you won't know why you did it. And that's exactly what happens. She, wakes up in a normal state. Hypnotists often end their sessions with, you're waking up feeling rested and relaxed, better than you felt before. And she takes 2 bites of her food, and there is her shoe and sock. And somebody asks her, why did you do that? She goes, I don't know. Well, Maury is a perpetual skeptic. He spends basically the first half of this book qualifying the fact that he's even doing this in the first place. But after he sees this effective demonstration of hypnosis, there were a few other notes in there too. He gets very, very curious at this tool, which has such awesome power to explore the boundaries of the mind. I mean, there are examples of curing allergies and headaches. There are things that we don't know about our physiological states that can be altered, affected in trance. So this is where it starts. So Maury picks this up, learns everything he can in hypnosis.
Yeah, so he had no hypnosis interest before that party, at least that it says. That's interesting.
So he, after he's, faced with this question of, well, why isn't everybody using this? Why is hypnosis not part of advertising and media and medicine? Why is it not on the docket for every student of psychology if it is this effective tool? And what he says is, I did eventually receive my answer. And in the 10 years, the answer has always been the same, which is essentially a shrug of the shoulders. Some people are better hypnotic subjects than others. It doesn't work the same way for everybody. And it's not something that you have quantitative evidence and can say this works in the same way. So anyway, back to Maury. He's a very scrupulous person. He's very meticulous about everything that he does. So he prepares heavily for all of his sessions. And the first experiments that he did after he's combing through the files on hypnosis, both here and at the New York Public Library where his business took him, he basically starts off on a textbook case and he hypnotizes his wife and effectively in one session cures her of her migraines. And he's hooked. He's on it.
Yeah.
So at the behest of a friend of his who was a doctor, he volunteers for a number of years in the outpatient therapy at the local hospitals, working with particularly difficult or psychosomatic cases, things where the doctors would say there's nothing physically wrong with you, but there was still an ailment, there was still an illness, and they were just difficult. And Maury did have quite a few breakthroughs with people in that regard. But in the daily occurrences of
and this is all happening in Pueblo, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bulk of the story happens in Pueblo.
Yeah.
There are a few of the taped sessions that are in Rye.
Sure.
But, the county at least. So he's there. Maury is, doing these experiments or keeping an accurate log of everything that he's doing in this outpatient center. And every once in a while it comes up in conversation in his business. People ask you, what do you do for a hobby all the time? And he says, I'm a hypnotist. And through this string of events that is inexplicable, he starts to receive these resources on things that are a little bit more fringe. I mean, people already mistrust hypnotists. They think that hypnotists are some sort of snake that is going to cause you to do things that you don't want to do. And the fact of the matter is, majorly, the medical consensus is, even if you are in a deep hypnotic trance, you still have that self-preservation. You still have that conscious factor that doesn't allow you to do anything that would put you in danger. Now, mixed results, of course, there are some places where you get into real deep traumas or whatever, and with the wrong suggestions coming out of hypnosis, that can cause some unseemly effects later down the road. But for the most part, especially for those who are trained, hypnosis is a safe and effective practice. But he keeps getting these questions, these resources that pull up. First, he learns about Edgar Cayce, who was a very interesting case coming out of Kentucky. He was your average Christian farmer who had, no interest in anything other than doing his daily work. But he, under trance, speaks like a doctor, a full-out medical doctor, and was able to diagnose ailments in people that regular medicine just couldn't touch. Not only was he able to do that, but he could do that from half the world away. Edgar Cayce has thousands and thousands of cases, but and about an 80% success rate, if I remember correctly, for these health readings that he did. He could tell you where in the body the ailment was once he connected with this person, and all he needed was a name and an address. He could tell you what is causing it, whether it was physical or spiritual, sometimes what would remedy it. And so Maury Bernstein was given a book of Edgar Cayce's, essentially, or about Edgar Cayce. And, pulling from some other resources in what's called parapsychology. That is extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, clairaudience, telekinesis, psychokinesis, the list goes on. But you sort of get that idea, that taboo, that fringe. It was a place that he didn't even want to go. But it just kept coming into his purview, into his life, until he finally found what he thought were some legitimate sources about doctors who were doing crazy experiments in telekinesis. They'd have two people that were hypnotized in separate rooms, and they would show one person a flashcard with a series of images on it, normal stuff, cup, water bottle, etc. And there was an extraordinarily high success rate of the other hypnotized person being able to recognize that card from some sort of mental link. It stretches your brain. Awesome. It's and so.
Yeah. What do you think? Where do you think Maury was in terms of the skepticism you mentioned earlier at this point, as he's reading these other stories?
I mean, he was ultimately, he rejected it at every turn, or he tried to. Yeah. But because of his rational and inquisitive nature, he still read the books. He still did the research. And what he found was that while this area in medical science, you could kind of call it a third rail in medical science, remained unexplored, there were still questions to be asked there. There was still an extraordinary power that hadn't been tamed, which is why he had to seek out for himself to do this. So where he was particularly interested was the idea of reincarnation or past lives. Yeah. And thus the nature of his experiments had to do with past lives of people. So he found this exceptional subject, Virginia Tighe, who could go into a deep somnambulistic trance.
What were some of the factors that maybe he mentioned that made her a more, willing or more successful somebody to be hypnotized?
Being able to be open to suggestion in the first place. Hypnotists make bad hypnotic subjects. Skeptics make bad hypnotic subjects because if you are trying to rationalize everything that the hypnotist is saying to you, then your conscious mind is going to reject it before your subconscious can ever accept it or do anything with it. So Tig was able to go into a deep trance, meaning that once she had gone through that initial, relaxed state, look at the candle held 18 inches from your face at 45 degrees, go to sleep, go to sleep, go to sleep. Once she got there and was able to stay there, her trance was deeper than many of the subjects that he had encountered before. And that's just dependent on people.
That's interesting.
Everybody has a different level there. Some people claim they can't be hypnotized. And while that's not necessarily true, while you can accept suggestions even under a light trance or under no trance at all, there are others, still very strong-minded, thinking, rational people, but they're just able to get to that more relaxed, open to suggestion, accepting place. And we still don't know what makes that difference in a person. So the fact that it was Ginny Tig was just what his best subject was that he had encountered. I was hearing something earlier about how ultimately her allergies were cured from this, from something completely different. But Morrie wants to set up this experiment. And it starts in what's called a past life regression. So the hypnotist will get you into a trance, get you calm, relaxed in that place, and then invite you to explore a previous time in your life. So it would read something like, now go back to when you were 8 years old. 8 years old. Find a place. You're in a room. Where are you? Now, hypnotic subjects are able to respond with a regular language, and they're able to describe what's in their mind's eye. So in many of these examples of regression, they'll tell you about how far the blackboard was away, or which row that they sat in class, and what were the names of the people to the left and the right. Not only that, but they'll also bring back some of those habits and mannerisms that they had when they were that age. They'll start speaking in a more childlike voice. They'll start using more simplistic words. And so this age regression can go basically as far back as almost birth. There are examples where they say, go back to where you're 1 year old. Now, what do you, when you want a glass of water, what do you say? And the subject will say, wah. And then, Morrie would ask, when you want a glass of milk, what do you say? And the subject responds, well, I didn't. I don't have a word for that. They respond from their conscious adult self. Because, you're regressed back to 1 year old. You don't lose that in this process. There's still that additional context that applies. But it does, really, you see it present itself in people's mannerisms. So what Morrie was interested in doing was going over the hump. That's how he says it, over the hump.
So that had been happening, the past life regression within your own life. Was it just Morrie, or was that happening with other hypnotists as well?
Well, past life regression being moving back to a past life, just the age regression aspect
that's
of
what I'm talking about.
Within the current life, that was an already sort of standard.
So that's happening already. He's getting involved in that.
He's learning about that from the textbooks, and he's applying it.
That makes sense.
Because age regressions are oftentimes used to handle, say, childhood traumas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You bring them up, you address them, you recode them, in essence, in the mind, And then that allows somebody to psychologically be free or move on from wherever that is. So
interesting.
He starts with the regressions, and he's pretty good at that. And he's got a great subject. And what he's interested in this first session is seeing if he can push back beyond that 1-year-old mark. You're going back further. Think even further and further until you see yourself in a different place, in a different time, or a different people. Tell me what you see.
So did he already believe in reincarnation before, probably? Or is he just experimenting around with that?
Yeah, this is his experiment to determine. You know, reading only takes you so far.
For sure.
So say the other thing that Casey did besides the health readings was life readings. In other words, if you had a psychological ailment, he would be able to tell you if there was some trauma from a past life that was manifesting in a certain way.
Interesting.
And it's all, you know, surrounded around trying to determine whether this fringe is baloney or not.
Sure.
It's what we're still trying to do today when we're faced with things occult or unusual or taboo. So he pushes Teague back. And there are recorded sessions of this. The first one was actually available on vinyl, but it's over 6 hours of testimony. And in this, you can see, or you can hear, that Teague changes her accent. Suddenly she devolves into an Irish brogue. She speaks markedly differently and introduces herself as Bridey. Well, the records are unclear. This was all on reel to reel. So at first they thought her name was Friday, and she actually corrected them. What's interesting is that throughout the tapes, you know, Bridey has a sense of humor. She's a real person. She speaks naturally, fluently, as though she is from that time. And this is exactly what the story is surrounding. There's this whole other person that is coming out of this hypnotic subject who is giving specifics about her life.
How specific?
Well, she was born in 1798 and she died in 1864. She gave the names of her siblings, her parents, her husband. She described moving from Belfast in Ireland to Cork when she got married, having 2 different marriage ceremonies because of the Protestant Catholic divide. She described shops that she went to. And it really gets into the nitty-gritty level of detail of when she asks for a handkerchief as Bridey, she's asking for a linen. And these were the kinds of things, as we get later into the story, that really start to make the difference. Now, you know, Maury would have never written the book had he not been encouraged by a journalist who is in Pueblo, William Barker, to write this down, to get it published, to get it out. He said, there's something really interesting in this that you have to explore, you have to bring out to the public. And so he does. In his own style, writes about the events and the unfolding of these, and commits to himself, Maury, to not try and seek out the specific details. He doesn't want to be involved in that process because he needs to have a neutrality as the hypnotist. However, when the American media at large hears about it, they're sending journalists 10,000 miles to go look through, 100-year-old court records.
Sending him to Ireland. Interesting.
To just to try and corroborate, and they talked with experts on linguistics as to some of her mannerisms and patterns of speech. There's this little thing about a particular type of cup that you make a wish in that was called a brate. And so a part of the book discusses was it actually called a brate at this time, or was there some disambiguation?
That's meticulous.
Crazy. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is the story still hasn't been proven nor disproven because of that level of detail. The records are faulty because do you expect somebody in Ireland 150 years ago to keep clear, meticulous, in cursive ledger and for those to still be survived? So looking at the story now from this perspective, you look back and go, well, there's really not much more that we can do to try and prove the existence of Bridey Murphy.
Yeah.
And that is on its own an interesting little aspect. Pueblo has its archives of all of this information that comes to present. But what remains unexplored in the story and why I remain passionate about it is what is not told in the book and the reception of the story itself. So, the book publishes in 1954, the first edition with Doubleday. And then a couple of years later, the second edition comes out, which is what I had read from, and it includes debunking the debunkers because
people were skeptical around the country and were trying to break it down.
It was an onslaught. I mean, it was divisive. It was like things now where, some people were rattled by the story and they believed in it fully. They invested into it. And then other people, specifically medical professionals at the time and, religious leaders of thought, were all very heavily against it, as well as some major publications. Life magazine did an article about this, describing the phenomenon as a hypnotizzy. People were having parties, come as you were parties is what they were called, and dressing and pretending to be people from past lives. There was a reincarnation cocktail. But the movie or the book really gave huge impressions to the American media, to the point that it was then transmuted into a movie. It was turned into a vinyl record, that first recording of the actual hypnotic session. And there's just so many articles out there that are talking about this, trying to make some sense out of it. And it's like they're all different somehow. It's really funny. You expect that there would be some consistency in a story that's so focused on details. But what remains interesting is that everybody who encounters it takes away something different and gets on this insatiable drive of self-discovery almost. They have to ask the question for themselves. If it's not necessarily, is reincarnation possible? Is reincarnation a thing? It's what remains unexplored in the boundaries of the human mind. What remains unexplored in my mind, with a different cultural context and narrative, we can kind of look at it as that hacking. That's all the rage now is hack your brain. And it is. It's to a certain extent, with that hypnotic tool, with post-hypnotic suggestion, in other words, what's left with you when you leave the hypnotic session, where can you get to in terms of changing your habits, your behaviors, becoming the best version of yourself, healing traumas. That's what Morey was focused on. He wanted this to be a tool that was accessible to everybody. What the media focused on was just trying to get to the bottom of the facts. And it really affected everybody who was involved. Virginia Tighe ended up having to move to Denver with her children. She remarried. They were being bullied so badly because mom was Bridey Murphy. She spent the rest of her life trying to stay out of the limelight, except for a couple of dime exceptions. Because
she didn't remember that part of the hypnotism, right? You were telling me that off before we started recording, right? What was her reaction to being hypnotized like that? Did she remember talking about that? Or?
She was shocked. She was surprised at first, but she didn't remember actually saying those things. When she listened over the tape, she said, yeah, that's my voice, but I wasn't saying that. And there is one exception talked about in the book, because where the record only has the first session, the back half of the book is a transcript of everything. And one of the post-hypnotic suggestions that she had was they were talking about dancing and music. And there was this particular Irish jig, which she called the morning jig. And so Maury says, well, when you come out of your trance, you're going to be moved to dance this Irish jig that you remember. And then the book describes later on that she stands in the middle of the room after some eking on, like, hey, don't you want to do something? Isn't there, don't you feel like dancing right now? She goes, no, not particularly. Well, why don't you try just standing in the middle of the room and see if anything comes to you? And suddenly her feet fly into a flurry, and she does this beautiful jig, and she ends it with her hand over her mouth and then opening out like this. And she says, and that's to symbolize a yawn. It's a morning jig. This is the level of detail we're talking about, So that was the only exception where Tig was really present and aware of the phenomena outside of the actual trance sessions. And she has spoken on the record saying that she regrets it, but that she would do it all over again. And it really sounded like it was just the matter of the public trying to search after this occult thing.
It was more the reaction than what actually happened.
Yeah. And so everybody in the story seems to kind of come under ill fate. I mean, even when you get down into the nitty gritty, the differences between the book and the movie, for instance, Maury makes an example of a false equivalency in the book. And it's kind of funny. He says, well, Maury Bernstein doesn't smoke and saints don't smoke. So thus Maury Bernstein must be a saint. And he's using this in reference to another point that he's making. But I thought that was funny when I went and watched the movie, and the Maury Bernstein of the movie is chain smoking like all of Hollywood in the 50s. And the ending is completely different.
Oh, sure. Make it more dramatic. Yeah.
Yeah. The movie leaves it at, we were all so afraid that she almost didn't come out of this trance and that she was just going to stay Bridey Murphy forever. And then the last couple of minutes are just sort of the wiping off of the brow, like, oh, glad that didn't happen. Whereas that really wasn't the case in the book, in the actual sessions. There was a little bit where she sneezed, Tig sneezed, and where before she was relaxed and reclined and had her eyes sort of half closed, she shot up stark still, eyes wide open, and they thought that she had been shocked out of trance. The reality was she was still Bridey at the time. That's when she asks for the handkerchief. But everybody who was in the room at that time was ready to call it quits with that session. They all got a real sinking gut feeling about it. Anyway, so going back to ill fates.
Yeah.
Tig has to move. Tig has to move. And Maury Bernstein, who had this beautiful, opulent house over by Parkview, and who was himself a brilliant investor in the stock market. He had money behind him. He owned a lot of the land that Canyon City sits on now. He had the land that the Convention Center and the Sangre Arts Center sit on now. All of that sort of vanished towards the end of his life. And he ends up in a little apartment across from Dutch Clark Stadium with his windows foiled over, basically a recluse. It was said that by a neighbor that he had a Cadillac parked out in a spot out front that he swore never moved for 20 years, never moved out of its spot. His grocer and his barber would come to the house, visit him, and bring him what he needed. And he ended up having conservators as well. The question that remains about him is, where did this all go?
Yeah.
Maury was a little bit frail at the end of his life. He was kind of described as the Howard Hughes of Pueblo, and he takes on a similar life path trajectory. People kind of thought that he went mad. And having gone back through the book, he almost admits to why. He doesn't say it directly, but the stuff that he did to try and get himself in a hypnotic state in this sort of inquiry was, I mean, if you look at it today, it's crazy. He went through electroshock therapy voluntarily. He underwent a procedure where they'll put a mask over your face and pipe in CO2, just like they would oxygen now. So essentially it was CO2 poisoning for 60, 80 seconds consecutively, you know, in sessions.
And this was all to try and get himself past that, you know, first level of I'm a skeptic. I'm not a very good hypnotic subject, but I want to experience that.
Right. He wanted to explore that place in his own mind.
Yeah.
Now, it should be known that for hypnotic subjects, a common practice is the first session always takes longer. But then the hypnotist will add in a post-hypnotic suggestion, essentially a trigger, so that that individual will almost instantly go into trance the next time. So it would be like when I count to 3 and snap my fingers 3 times. And then suddenly you're in conversation later, it's happening, and they go 1, 2, 3, you know, and they're there. So I could see where Maury was going there and why he did all of these crazy things, because once you get there, you can auto-suggest. You can start to work with the tools that the hypnotist is providing you, and you can start to consciously recognize it. There are people who can put themselves into states of trance and then basically self-hypnotize to whatever nth degree. And everybody has a different way of going about that. Yeah. The story is really, really interesting. Yeah. And the subject of hypnosis at large, while it is sort of a taboo subject, it's present in our everyday lives in strange and mysterious ways. Primarily, if you've ever bought a chicken sandwich because it looked really juicy and good on the television advertisement that you saw yesterday, you have been the recipient of an effective suggestion. You don't have to be in trance for that to happen. You just have to passively accept it, and then you have to act on it. So now, 21st century, we are constantly bombarded with TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, television, anything but print. And it's coming to us at a breakneck speed to where, you know, our conscious minds can't even keep up. But our subconscious mind accepts everything. Your subconscious mind knows every word in every book you've ever read, line for line in order, and can recall that. At least that's what's speculated. So to learn about this story is to understand that studying hypnosis, looking at it from that same skeptical place that Maury did, is a great tool for building up one's own mental resiliency. For then being able to see those advertisements or those triggers or that suggestion or that sales tactic out in the real world, consciously see it and say, I do not accept this, to be able to control what passes that filter into the subconscious mind. That, I think, is the best takeaway, but there is going to be so much more to explore in the upcoming months in the Star Journal. We're hoping we've got a couple articles, it sounds like, slated now, and access to all of Maury Bernstein's personal records and files. We're talking everything, the reel-to-reel of all 6 hours of that conversation, all of his notes from every hypnotic trance that he performed, whether it was at the hospital or otherwise in his own personal experiments, his letters after the fact to Virginia Tighe and to the Doubleday Publishing and to, everybody else who was involved in the media to try and clear his own name, to try and get this scandal resolved. But it was just a bear. It was. So I'm hoping to gain some insight in that search, my own search.
Yeah.
And that's the other takeaway is we, when encountering this story by the author, are encouraged to look for ourselves, to look in and to ask not only the questions about all of that crazy taboo fringe stuff, but also about how much control we have over our own mind and what this means in the grand scheme of things. I'm really looking forward to inviting that sort of dialogue, as well as sending those who are minded alike to go and really dig deeper into what records we have about the story at large, and see if there's not something that we can surface that hasn't been seen or addressed yet.
Why do you think that it's not a big name Pueblo story? You mentioned this in your article. Like, we don't see a 11-year-old project about it. We don't see a lot. I personally, I've been living in Pueblo for, Pueblo County for 10, 12 years.
Right.
I feel like I'm a student of history.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard about this until it came across our desk a few months ago. So
I know.
Why do you think Pueblo hasn't embraced it?
Well, to be fair, firstly, there is a diorama inside the Pueblo Convention Center.
Oh, great.
It's sort of tucked away, unlit, next to some chairs that are, stored
Stacked up
aside
over there.
in a side room. But there's one side is about the Bernstein brothers and the other side is about the Bridey story. I think that from what I have collected of personal stories in town, at first nobody was really interested. Everybody kind of looked at it and went, well, why does this matter? What's it to me? And then as the story grew its own legs and became this national sensation, it sort of started to feel like bad press, especially for Pueblo. After everything had sort of worn its groove, and given the fate of the actual people involved, I think that people had a general hesitancy toward it. They don't want to touch it. There are people who are unwilling to explore questions of this nature. And I can't really say one way or the other why we haven't added Maury Bernstein and the search into our lexicon of Pueblo stories. Maybe because there are so many other heroes in this town. The Medal of Honor winners, the people who were, rescuing ladies up from third floors of buildings after the Pueblo flood. There have been so many exceptional things that have happened here that it's easy for the littler stories. Oh, I shouldn't say the littler stories. That it's easy for some of those stories to get lost in the mire. We can take another crack at this, This happened 67 years ago at this point, which means there are people in Pueblo who were alive at the time of these real events and got impressions about it. And, I'm hearing now that the Star Journal is all about voices. It's all about recognizing, the collective voice of Pueblo, but also individuals within the community. I want to start to eke out some of these personal stories as well. And then we'll really see why people are so afraid to touch it. Because to be honest with you, I'm not entirely certain. This comes across to me, this search for everybody who's been, who's encountered it. It seems like the carpet rolls itself out in front of you. Like I said at the beginning, I could have let this whole thing go. I wrote my article. I was happy-ish with, how it turned out. And I figured I did the public a service by telling them about it once again. But I didn't expect to, a month later or so, hear from the man who owned the house that Maury Bernstein lived in at the time. who also happened to be a collector of all Bridey-related paraphernalia. That was my first access to the book, because the book is notoriously difficult to find, and to the record. And then everything sort of unfolds and opens up from there. So if this story is meant for you, if you're meant to get anything out of that, then I have a feeling you're going to feel that. It's going to be a personal interest, and then it's going to be a drive. And I hope that, everybody maintains their coherence throughout the whole endeavor, because we are working with some pretty heady topics that have to do with universalism, religion, etc. We could go real broad on this, but I think there are some specific points that would be really good to inquire.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, let me just say, I'm inspired by your search into it, and it gets me really curious as well. And I'm sure there's people that are listening that get them curious.
I sure hope so.
So
I sure hope to have some help in this, because there are a couple of people I've run across who are passionate and engaged, and they've been to the places and they've done the things. But I think that collectively as a community, we can give this another pass, and we can put Maury Bernstein properly in the Pueblo pantheon as is deserved. Because at the end of the day, he ran a successful business too that I never heard about, you know, and he was a philanthropist. So let's give some older voices their proper credence and see where it brings us.
That's well said.
Well, thank you.
Taylor, thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I so enjoy it, and I look forward to continuing, maybe being on again someday.
I plan to have you on again in the future, because you're going to be doing more articles for us, hopefully, whether that's on Bridey or on other things. But once again, if you want to read the actual article that Taylor wrote, go check that out on pueblostarjournal.org, or you can go pick up the Star Journal at one of our pickup locations. You can also find that on our map on our website. Guys, thank you so much for listening. For Ben and Taylor, have a great rest of your day.